The gravel crunching beneath the tires of Dom Vance's worn SUV sounded like grinding bone as they pulled into Pine Ridge Campground. Tucked into a dense, forgotten wedge of the Blackwood timberland, the site was surrounded by ancient white pines that choked out the dying afternoon light. Beside him, Clara unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned over the dashboard, her eyes scanning the half-dozen tents scattered across the clearing. "It's definitely isolated," she murmured, a trace of unease lacing her voice as she took in the towering wall of timber surrounding them. "That's the whole point of Backcountry Weekend, isn't it?" Marcus chimed in from the back seat, adjusting his camera strap and cracking a broad, easy grin. Dom turned off the engine, and an immediate, heavy silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the ticking of the cooling exhaust. He looked down at the local news clipping resting in his center console, its bold headline warning of 3 missing hikers who had vanished along the eastern ridge over the last 2 full moons. The rangers had blamed aggressive black bears, but the locals down in the valley town spoke of something far older, far more calculated, and far more lethal. Stepping out into the crisp mountain air, Dom stretched his limbs and inhaled the sharp scent of pine sap, damp earth, and the faint trace of campfire smoke. The campsite was modest, featuring a centralized stone fire pit where a few other campers were already gathered as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Among them stood Greg, an overly chatty hunter in heavy canvas gear who was currently cleaning a field knife while boasting about his tracking skills to anyone within earshot. Sitting slightly apart from the group on a split log bench was Sam, a quiet hitchhiker with a shadowy demeanor and sharp, darting eyes that seemed to evaluate every movement in the camp. Setting up camp before the light completely fails would be a wise choice, a calm, firm voice called out from near the communal supply shed. Dom turned to see Park Ranger Miller approaching, his silver badge glinting faintly in the dimming twilight, his expression inscrutable beneath a broad-brimmed hat. The wind drops fast after sunset, and these woods can become treacherous if you wander off the marked paths, Miller added, his gray eyes lingering on Dom for a bit longer than necessary. Dom noticed the ranger wore thick leather gloves despite the mild evening warmth, and his movements possessed an uncanny, fluid grace that felt oddly predatory. Marcus immediately began setting up their tent on a small grassy knoll near the edge of the forest perimeter, while Clara helped Dom unpack the heavy iron cook kit and lanterns. As the sky shifted from brilliant orange to a bruise-like purple, the temperature plummeted with surprising speed. The other campers began drawing closer to the central fire, seeking warmth as the dense shadows stretched outward from the surrounding tree line. Dom walked over to join them, carrying a box of dry kindling, his eyes scanning the faces around the flickering flames to gauge their company. Greg was busy displaying a polished silver pocket watch, proudly boasting that it was a family heirloom he brought on every hunting expedition for good luck. Strangely, as Greg passed the gleaming trinket toward Ranger Miller, the park officer subtly recoiled, clasping his gloved hands tightly behind his back and stepping away from the radiance of the fire. "Keep your trinkets to yourself, Hunter," Miller muttered dryly, his voice carrying an icy undertone that silenced the polite laughter around the circle. Sam, sitting in the shadows, let out a soft, dry chuckle, his nostrils flaring slightly as though he were drinking in the rich scent of roasting meat coming from Greg's camp stove. The atmospheric tension hung heavily in the air, thick and palpable as the sky turned pitch black and the full moon began its ascendance above the jagged ridge. Dom leaned against a wooden post, feeling a sudden prickle of cold sweat down the back of his neck as he realized how unnaturally quiet the surrounding forest had become. The crickets had stopped chirping, the night birds had gone silent, and even the rustling breeze seemed to hold its breath. He looked up into the canopy, where the pale silver light of the full moon poured through the pine branches like cold water. Suddenly, a low, reverberating howl tore through the stillness, originating from deep within the dense timber less than a mile away. It wasn't the high-pitched yip of a coyote or the mournful cry of a common gray wolf. It was a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the ground beneath their boots. Greg immediately dropped his knife, his face instantly draining of color as he scrambled towards his rifle case leaning against his tent. Ranger Miller stood motionless at the edge of the campsite, his head tilted back slightly, his nostrils twitching as he stared up at the glowing lunar disk with an expression that looked disturbingly like hunger. Clara grabbed Dom's arm, her fingers digging through his jacket as she pointed toward the dark tree line bordering their sight. "Dom, look at the foliage," she whispered, her voice trembling violently as two glowing yellow irises reflected the firelight from deep within the brush. Whatever was watching them was massive, standing far taller than any normal quadruped, its broad silhouette hunched between two massive oak trunks. It didn't rush forward blindly, like a rabid beast. Instead, it stepped backwards into the deep shadows with deliberate, calculating patience. Dom reached into his pocket and gripped his heavy steel multi-tool, feeling a terrifying realization wash over him as he surveyed the campsite. The beast was not just hunting in these woods, it was already among them, watching, waiting, and choosing its moment to strike. The full moon was now fully unveiled overhead, bathing the camp in an ethereal glow as the true nightmare of Blackwood timberland began. Panic rippled through the Pine Ridge campground as the creature vanished into the thick foliage beyond the clearing. Greg racked the bolt of his hunting rifle with trembling hands, his eyes darting frantically from tree to tree as he backed up against a massive white pine. "That wasn't any normal wolf," he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain of raw terror as he aimed the barrel into the dark brush. "I've hunted big game across 3 states, and nothing moves like that. Nothing stands that tall on 2 legs." "Lower the weapon, Hunter," Ranger Miller commanded, stepping forward with an eerie, composed authority that instantly drew everyone's attention. "Firing blindly into the dark will only draw the predator directly into our perimeter or hit another camper." Dom watched Miller closely, noting how the ranger's breathing remained entirely steady, his face bathed in the harsh silver moonlight without a single trace of fear. Beside them, Sam stood near the shadows of the supply shed, a subtle dark smile playing at the corners of his lips as he watched Greg sweat. "We need to get to our vehicles and drive back down to the valley town right now," Clara insisted, her hand gripping Dom's sleeve tightly as she pulled him toward the SUV. Dom nodded, keying the remote unlock as they hurried across the damp grass toward the parking strip. But when he reached his driver's side door and pulled the handle, a sickening crunch rang out beneath his boots in the night air. The front left tire was completely shredded, not by a simple puncture but sliced through the thick rubber by massive, razor-sharp claws. Marcus ran over to inspect his own vehicle, letting out a sharp curse as he discovered all 4 of his truck's tires slashed down to the rims. "It sabotaged us," Marcus breathed, his face going pale as he looked around at the dark wall of forest surrounding them. "It targeted the tires specifically, so we couldn't drive away. It knows exactly what it's doing." Dom crouched down by the ruined rubber, examining the deep, clean incisions made with calculated, terrifying precision. This was not the random rampage of a mindless monster. This was a methodical siege executed by a creature that possessed human intellect. Before anyone could speak, a horrifying scream tore through the night from the opposite side of the campsite where the supply shed stood. Dom, Greg, and Ranger Miller sprinted toward the sound, their flashlight beams cutting through the heavy darkness in frantic arcs. They arrived just in time to see Sam pinned against the wooden wall of the shed, his shoulder torn open and bleeding profusely. It jumped from the canopy," Sam gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. "It came from above. It was huge, covered in thick gray fur, with yellow eyes that burned like hot coals." Greg swung his rifle upward, shining his weapon light high into the surrounding pine branches, but only swayed limbs met his sight. "We need to fortify the main ranger cabin," Miller stated calmly, pointing toward a heavy log structure situated 50 yards away. "The walls are solid oak, and the doors can be barred from the inside until daylight breaks." Dom helped pull Sam to his feet, noticing that despite his gruesome appearance of the blood, Sam's eyes were sharp, observing every move Miller made. As the group retreated toward the cabin, Dom lagged slightly behind, his mind assembling the puzzle pieces with growing dread. He remembered how Miller had recoiled from Greg's solid silver pocket watch near the fire, hiding his leather-gloved hands in the dark. He also noted how Miller seemed to know the exact layout of the forest traps and always directed the group deeper into isolated structures. Yet, as they crossed the threshold into the cabin, Dom caught a glimpse of Miller's leather glove slipping off. His skin was completely unblemished, showing no silver burns at all. Dom's stomach dropped as he realized the terrifying truth. The beast was playing a double game of trickery and psychological warfare. The subtle recoil of the campfire hadn't been an involuntary reaction to Silver, it had been a deliberate actor's cue to cast suspicion on the wrong man. The creature was framing Ranger Miller to keep the campers divided and paranoid, while it orchestrated their demise from within or without. Suddenly, the heavy wooden roof above them creaked under an immense, shifting weight, and the ceiling beams began to groan under a terrifying pressure. A low, mocking chuckle vibrated down through the chimney flue, sounding horrifyingly human, yet laced with predatory hunger. Dom looked at his friends, knowing that the cabin wasn't a fortress to protect them, it was a trap, and the door was already shut. Heavy dust showered down from the timber beams as the massive weight above paced along the cabin roof with deliberate, measured steps. Greg raised his rifle toward the ceiling, his hands shaking so violently that the barrel knocked against an overhead lantern with a shrill metallic clang. "It's on top of us," he shrieked, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as he backed into the center of the room. "It drove us right into this wooden box so it could pick us off, one by one." "Keep your head, Hunter," Ranger Miller barked, unholstering his heavy service revolver and aiming it firmly toward the fortified front door. The walls are 6-inch pine logs, and the shutters are reinforced with iron deadbolts. It doesn't matter how thick the wood is, if it can tear through steel like parchment, Dom warned, his eyes locked on the ceiling dust falling into Clara's hair. He stepped between Clara and the broad brick fireplace, his mind racing through every piece of classic folklore he had ever read regarding the beast. Silver was the absolute standard, a pure, unyielding killer of lycanthropes. But none of them possessed silver weapons, except for Greg's delicate pocket watch. Wolfgang lore, however, spoke of other vulnerabilities: Wolfsbane, blessed iron, and the overwhelming vulnerability to fire when pushed into a corner. Suddenly, a violent crash shattered the silence as a massive clawed arm smashed straight through the high clerestory window near the roofline. Shards of thick glass rained down onto the floorboards, followed instantly by the sickening stench of iron, wet fur, and rotting meat. Marcus screamed as a shadowy, thick-furred appendage reached downward, snatching him by the shoulder of his jacket with terrifying speed. Dom lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the waist and pulling with all his strength, while Greg fired 2 wild shots through the broken window frame. The deafening gunshots echoed inside the enclosed room, filling the air with acrid gunpowder smoke and blinding flashes of light. A guttural roar of annoyance, rather than pain, erupted from the roof as the creature released Marcus, leaving deep, bloody gouges across his shoulders canvas. "It's testing us," Clara yelled, holding Marcus back toward the heavy oak table in the center of the room to tend to his wounds. "It isn't just trying to kill us, it's driving us into a frenzy so we make a mistake." Sam, sitting near the far corner with his arm wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, let out a hollow, terrifying laugh that drew everyone's attention. "You still don't get it, do you?" Sam hissed, his dark eyes glittering with an unnatural amber luminosity in the dim light. "You think you're holding out until dawn, but the night has barely begun, and the wolf never leaves a hunt unfinished." Dom turned his flashlight beam directly onto Sam's face, noticing for the first time that the hitchhiker's pupils were dilated into vertical slits. "It was you," Dom realized aloud, his voice dropping to a dangerous steady tone as the pieces finally snapped together. "The attack at the shed was staged. You slashed your own arm to draw us out and direct suspicions towards Miller." Sam's smile widened, revealing elongated needle-sharp canine teeth that glistened with thick saliva under the beam of light. "Miller was just an obstacle, an authority figure to frame while I prepared the main course," Sam chuckled, his bones making a horrific cracking sound as his limbs began to elongate. Greg shrieked and aimed his rifle at Sam's chest, but before he could squeeze the trigger, the roof structure directly above them caved in with a thunderous roar. A second, even larger beast descended through the broken rafters, an alpha, 7 feet tall, with matted black fur and crimson eyes that burned like living coals. The pack had never been a single, solitary lone wolf. They were hunting in tandem, utilizing intellect and deception to trap their prey. The alpha swept its massive arm across the room, striking Greg with enough force to lift him off his feet and to launch him across the cabin floor into the stone fireplace. His rifle clattered uselessly across the boards, skittering straight toward the hearth, where bright orange embers still glowed under the ash. Dom grabbed Clara by the arm, shoving her toward the back storage room door as Ranger Miller opened fire with his service revolver at point-blank range. The lead bullets struck the Alpha's chest, but the monster merely growled, the flesh instantly knitting itself closed around the lead slugs. Dom knew they had seconds before total slaughter ensued, his eyes scanning the heart until they landed on a heavy iron fire poker resting in the embers, its tip glowing white-hot. Nearby lay Greg's fallen silver pocket watch, crushed under the debris, its pure silver casing cracked open to reveal the gleaming interior metal. Dom sprinted toward the fireplace, dodging a lethal swipe from Sam, whose hands had already transformed into lethal, fur-covered talons. Grabbing the white-hot iron poker with his right hand and scooping up the crushed silver watch with his left, Dom faced the two monsters, blocking their only avenue of survival. Firelight danced off the jagged edge of the crushed silver watch as Dom slammed it directly against the white-hot tip of the iron fire poker. The extreme heat instantly softened the pure metal, melting the silver casing across the glowing iron rod until it coated the metal tip in a molten, shimmering sheet. Sam lunged forward with a sickening snarl, his elongated jaws snapping open as he drove his razor-sharp claws directly toward Dom's throat. Dom sidestepped the wild strike with desperate speed and thrust the improvised silver-tipped spear straight into the center of Sam's chest. A blood-curdling shriek echoed through the cabin as the molten silver scorched through flesh and bone, reacting violently with the lycanthrope's unnatural physiology. Smoke poured from the wound as Sam collapsed onto the hardwood floor, thrashing violently as the silver poison coursed through his veins before he went entirely still. Seeing its packmate fall, the black-furred alpha roared in fury, its massive crimson eyes locking onto Dom with cold, murderous intent. It swiped its arm outward, catching Dom across the chest and hurling him backward against the storage room wall, sending painful shocks through his ribs. Ranger Miller fired his final round into the beast's face, distracting the Alpha long enough for Clara to dash from the storage room carrying a heavy jug of kerosene from the emergency supplies. She uncapped the jug and hurled the liquid across the Alpha's fur, dousing the creature in volatile fuel as it turned its monstrous head toward her. "Dom, now!" Clara screamed, diving behind the overturned oak table just as the monster snapped its jaws inches from her arm. Dom scrambled to his feet, grabbed a burning pine log directly from the hearth, and hurled it with all his remaining strength at the gasoline-soaked beast. The Alpha erupted into a towering pillar of flame, letting out a deafening howl of agony as the fire consumed its matted black fur and scorched its flesh. Driven by raw pain and burning flesh, the creature abandoned its calculated hunt, turning and smashing wildly through the cabin's rear wooden wall to escape into the cool night air. The creature vanished into the thick timber, its agonized screams fading rapidly into the vast, silent depths of the blackwood forest. Dom slumped against the broken wall, gasping for breath as the silence of the wilderness slowly settled over the ruined cabin once again. Ranger Miller immediately tended to Marcus and Greg, confirming that, while both were bruised and battered, their injuries were non-lethal and completely free of bites. As the first pale rays of dawn began to bleed through the forest canopy, casting a warm golden light over the campsite, the nightmare of the full moon finally drew to a close. Dom walked out onto the cabin porch, holding the cooled iron poker in his hand while staring into the deep, quiet woods where the Alpha had fled. He knew the creature was still out there, nursing its silver and fire burns in the deep mountain shadows, waiting patiently for the next full moon to rise.